Ken McCarthy, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
What is your background?
It's a good question. The most pertinent things are that I was very early in the commercialization of the internet, as in one of the handful of people that even thought it was possible. And, I'm one of the co-inventors of the banner ad, which is the foundation of digital advertising, which is the financial underpinning of the internet. But I was interested in the internet large. I wasn't just interested in advertising, but I knew it had to pay for itself or it wouldn't survive. So I was always doing experiments. One of my earliest experiments was using the internet for journalism. They say that somebody else had the first news blog, but his news blog was a year after mine. So I don't understand how they calculate that. So I believe I had one of the first, if not the first, news blogs. And I realized, wow, journalism is terrible. But I didn't know. I just was sort of reading the newspaper like everybody else and figuring out, okay, they're doing their best. And as what I thought was an innovation at the time was, hey, we can tell the whole story, because when you have TV or a newspaper, you only have a limited amount of space. So naively, I thought the reason they didn't tell everything was because they just didn't have space. So I thought, we're going to liberate that, and we have this website, and we can put hundreds of pages on about any story. So I was doing that about an election fraud that took place in San Francisco. And I soon discovered that the journalists didn't want to know anything more than the official line. And all they wanted to do was repeat the official line over and over and over and over again. They didn't want to do any investigation. So I guess I got hooked on investigative journalism. I keep saying I'm not a journalist, but I guess, I don't know, what is it, 25 years later, I guess I'm some kind of a journalist.
By saying that you are one of the fathers of the banner ad, you've probably destroyed half your audience right now.
I know, but they have to realize that if there were no financial underpinning, we wouldn't have, what we would have here, maybe they'll like me after this. There was a parallel track, an alternate reality that could have easily happened. And AOL showed the way, America Online, which some people are too young to even know what the heck I'm talking about. But in those days, the online world was a walled city. In other words, you had to log on to AOL, and you only got to see the content that was on the AOL server, believe it or not. And people were paying, by the minute to access this tiny little slice of knowledge. And Bill Gates saw this and thought, ooh, I want to get into that business. And he was on the verge of putting his own version of AOL, Microsoft version, on every desktop. And he's still, to this day, Microsoft still really controls the desktop. And that means we wouldn't have had an internet. We would have had the Bill Gates version of a walled city. And we would be paying him by the minute or by the month for whatever he saw fit to share with us. That could have easily happened. There was a little pivot point when the web was very tiny. Just so people know, at the beginning of 1993, nobody outside of a very tiny circle of tech people even heard of the web. By 1995, it was a global phenomenon. And the two things turned the corner on that. Number one was a financial foundation, which happened to be the banner ad, and the IPO, the initial public offering of a company called Netscape, which went to the moon. And people realized, oh, we can make money from this thing. And then all the resources started pouring in. But when I started and my colleagues started, the web was a very tiny thing. And we were all desperate to figure out a way to make it a big thing. We had no idea, by the way. To this day, we're all shocked at how big it became, because it was the smallest imaginable seed when it started.
I actually remember Netscape and AOL and Google hadn't come out yet, we were still using those little modems that make that funny sound,
right.
That connection sound.
Okay, so you've been around, but you must have been a kid.
Yeah, I was in school still. I can't even remember the other browsers, but I think Netscape was the main one.
Well, what happened? This was really interesting. So Netscape was the first out, and they owned 80% of the browser market. And then Microsoft said, "Oh no, we can't have this," and they came up with Internet Explorer and took the browser market and basically crushed Netscape, which was their business model. Their business model was, whatever you're doing, we'll just throw together something that looks like it, and we'll give it away for free, and you'll be destroyed. And that's how Microsoft, they started with their monopoly on the operating system, and then they used that operating system like a club, really, to pound every innovation in personal computing into the ground. Unless they owned it, they either would buy you at a low price and either integrate you or just throw your company on the trash heap. Or they would, if you didn't sell, if you weren't willing to sell, they would destroy you. That was basically their business model.
How did you go from that to piecing together the puzzle of the world as we see it right now?
Well, I've always been interested in the puzzle of the world. So to me, all that web work was just two things. One, I loved it. I loved the idea that anybody could publish anything, anytime, and anybody in the world, South Africa, UK, Malaysia, wherever they are, they could tune in. I thought that would be the greatest thing on earth if that could happen. And the reason I thought it was the greatest thing on earth is I'm a puzzle maker. I'm always putting puzzles together. I love books. My favorite place in the world when I was a kid was the library. So it's all part of a theme.
Okay, but the theme has been pretty dire in the last few years, hasn't it?
You know what? It maybe has always been dire, and somehow we've survived. Somehow the goodness of humanity has managed to survive somehow by the grace of God, some miracle or something innate in humanity. Because we've certainly had a lot of nefarious forces lined up against us for a long time. Now we just have a new flavor.
Obviously, I'm referencing the COVID era, and the segue there is your 2-volume series of books called Unveiling the COVID Con. The fact that you got 2 volumes suggests that the con was really big.
It was huge. It was huge, and unfortunately, without a historical perspective, it's hard to understand what's happening today. And it takes a lot of time to develop a historical perspective because you have to do a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. So that's what I think I contributed very early on, because some of those writings are from, my original tweet, February 1st, I believe, 2020, I said, this is a vaccine marketing exercise. And I said they're going to roll out a vaccine super fast, and they're going to use more speed than science. But it was, to me, it was very predictable because I've been watching pharma for decades now, and I know their little tricks. But this was their greatest hit. But they basically assembled a lot of expertise in propaganda that they'd been developing for many decades, and they just I think it surprised them. In fact, I know it did. I don't think they thought they could push it as far as they did. But they're in the game of always pushing the boundaries. And I think every time they pushed, they could go further. So they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. There really was no pushback, no significant pushback in the early months, unfortunately. And so they took it as far as it went.
So what happened?
Well, we have a thing called respiratory distress. And it's as old as humanity, and it's probably as old as mammals and reptiles. Maybe even fish have it. I don't know. But people get into respiratory distress, and it tends to be seasonal. And so when there's less sunlight, and when people are going outdoors less, they are more likely to have respiratory distress. And if they're very young and they have undeveloped, not fully developed immune systems, it may hit them hard. If they're not in good condition, it could be any age, it could hit them hard. So it was a framing. In other words, they took this natural occurrence and they put a frame around it, and they said, "Ooh, this time it's the most deadly occurrence ever." Now, if you want to go way back, we had something during World War I called the Great Flu. And you've heard about it, and they've been telling us for decades that the great flu is going to come back someday. We don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know what form, but we got to be ready. We have to be vigilant. But there was quite a bit of fraud about the great flu. For example, people seem to neglect the fact that the great flu occurred in the middle of one of the most ghastly wars, perhaps the most ghastly war ever conducted. You had men in trenches living without cooked food, without sanitation, exposed to the elements, under severe stress for months at a time. There'd never been warfare like that before. That does not lend to a healthy body, so if there's something to be caught, you will probably catch it. The other thing that they leave out of the history is there was severe food shortages during World War I, especially in Europe. Germany alone, which was and is a pretty well-developed country, had over 300 recorded major food riots. Okay, when's the last time you saw a food riot in a developed nation? I mean, even in an undeveloped, they don't happen very often. And over 300 recorded ones, which means there might have been more. So there was so the civilian population and the military were basically starving. And of course, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, war, it's a sequence. It's not, they don't all come together. First war, then famine, then pestilence, right? The war disrupts normal life. The disruption of normal life interrupts normal nutrition. When normal nutrition is interrupted, people are more vulnerable to illness. So there's so many interesting things about the Great Flu. One is nobody studied it when it was happening. They just sort of declared it was a flu. They didn't really do autopsies. They didn't really do scientific studies. So those didn't come until the 1920s. So the very first epidemiological study, occurred in the 1920s, and they made an estimate that worldwide 20 million people died of it. But it was a very, not a really super rigorous estimate. And then they stopped looking at it. They filed it away. It became one of these chapters in history until Anthony Fauci and friends took over at NIH and the CDC. And they were trying to rev up their bureaucratic power because they were put in business to deal with the kind of disease that's transmissible. Infectious disease, right? And infectious disease, thanks to plumbing, it was basically going nowhere. It was disappearing. It was becoming so rare. I mean, people would occasionally die of it. But it went from being a very, very, very serious problem. A lot of people, like even my grandparents, they lived in tenements in New York that had no indoor plumbing. Can you imagine? Of course people were dying of infectious disease. But infectious disease wasn't a big deal anymore. So they needed to gin up some threats. So what they did was they started a cottage industry of people revisiting the World War I flu. And so in the 80s, there was this explosion of scholarship about the Great Flu. And they raised the estimate from 20 million to 50 million based on nothing. And then more books are coming out. And then, every now and then they'd appear on the news saying, that Great Flu is terrible. It could come back anytime. We have to be vigilant. And now they've raised the estimate to 100 million died. So anyway, that's been the drumbeat for, since the 1980s. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And when Ebola hit Africa, and when Zika hit Brazil, and when bird flu came, they were trying to use that hysteria, that ground foundation of hysteria that they built very meticulously and very thoroughly to get more money and more power, right? And so the ground was laid, right? Then the other problem, and I don't know if I hope I sent you. Did I send you the book Fauci's First Fraud?
No, but I do have it. But I do have a digital copy in front of me.
Oh, okay. So Fauci came in the early 80s, and he immediately latched on to what he said was a contagious disease, which they gave the name of AIDS, right? Autoimmune deficiency syndrome. Now, whenever you see syndrome in a medical label, you know that it means they don't know. If it's a disease, you know how it's caused, what its mechanism is, and how to treat it. When they say syndrome, what's that?
They first called it GRID, I think.
Right. Right. And they tried to pin it on gay men. They said, oh, these guys, they caused this thing. That was the original thing they were trying to pull off. And that wasn't going well politically. So they changed it. Also, they became savvy. They realized, oh, this should be a disease for everybody. We'll make more money that way. We'll develop more power. So what they did was, first of all, catastrophic collapse of the immune system is real. That happens to people. But it happens at the end of a very long process. It usually happens with people that are elderly. They've been ill for a very long time. It's not something that people just suddenly get. Because again, it's a syndrome. It's like a collection of symptoms. It's still not a known disease. It's just a syndrome, right? So the very first lie was that, oh, this is happening to young, healthy men. And the truth is, the very first cases of this in youngish men, they were average age mid-30s, were people that had actually abused themselves quite badly. They had abusing drugs. They were also, there was it was a culture at the time, and
like Freddie Mercury.
Yeah, and it's like every population has a subsection of it that parties too much, right? They have too much of a good time, and this is what was happening in the 70s. And people were taking a lot of, again, a very narrow. This is very important to understand. A very narrow subset taking a ton of drugs, engaging in a lot of risky behavior, catching a lot of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, taking a lot of antibiotics, which is not good for you. If you need antibiotics, you take them. You don't. And there were folks that were taking them daily just in case. Well, that's not going to end well. Also, there was a certain drug that was very popular among a very small percentage of that larger community called poppers. And this was something that was, if someone's having a heart attack, you need to open up every blood vessel. You break this thing, and they inhale it, and everything opens up. So you do that in an emergency, but it's toxic. It's highly toxic. It's known to be toxic. Unfortunately, it became the party drug of choice. And you could go to a bar or a club or a bathhouse, and they would have booze, but they'd also have poppers for sale. And it was a chemical that you could make for a penny and sell for $2. So a lot of financial incentive. And unfortunately, at the time, the gay newspapers were financially supported by poppers marketers and manufacturers. So there were gay activists that were trying to sound the alarm and saying, guys, don't do this. This is dangerous. Don't do this. They couldn't get their articles or letters published in the press because the financial support for those newspapers was coming from the poppers manufacturers. So if you look at the early diseases that people had, they were in the nasal passage and they were in the lungs. So they had a sort of a cancer that normally is on the skin, but it was appearing in the nasal passage. And they also had a fungal infection in their lungs. Now, you don't need to be a PhD or a rocket scientist or an MD to know if you're inhaling a carcinogen a lot, like this was a really abused drug, you might hurt the immune system in your nose, right? And if you don't do that, you might hurt the immune system in your lungs. And the CDC, which is our supposed, great gods of public health, they knew this. They knew that poppers were dangerous, and they knew that poppers were being abused, and they deliberately kept the two knowledges from the public. They didn't say, hey, we know this is a dangerous substance and it's carcinogenic, and we know that some people are overabusing it, but we're not going to. So you had the media, specifically the gay newspapers, didn't share the information, and the CDC didn't share the information. Now, had that information been shared, a lot of lives could have been saved. But what they did was they said, oh, this disease it's everywhere. I got to tell you, when I was a kid in the 80s, I was in my 20s in the 80s, we all thought we were going to die. Everybody. And what's her, Oprah Winfrey, who's a very popular TV host, and she had an amazing, I think she had like 35 million viewers. She literally got on her show and said, within 5 years, by 1990, 1 out of 5 people in this audience is going to be dead from AIDS. She said that to an audience, a television audience. That's how frightened everybody was. And there was no cure. There was no treatment. And that was the other thing. They said, if you get this positive test, now you'll see where this rolls into COVID. If we test you, you may not have a symptom at all. You may be the healthiest guy in the world. But if you have this certain virus in you, you're a dead man. I knew a guy, he was healthy. He got the diagnosis. He went home and blew his brains out because the terror was so intense. So everyone's waiting now. See how this fits into COVID, right? Everybody's like, oh my God, the other thing there, it can spread so easy. If you just walk across the street and somebody on the other side of the street, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit. They made it seem like it was in the air. It was just blowing around and you were going to get it. And if you got it, you were dead. So when the cure finally arrived, and in their case, the cure was AZT. Does that ring a bell to you? You ever heard of that substance?
Yes, I mean, here in South Africa, it was a very, very big deal in the early 2000s. There was also I think the ARV rollout was one of the biggest in the world, which coincidentally aligned with a huge number of deaths.
Yeah, so for the listeners that don't know, AZT was a drug that they thought it was a chemotherapy for certain kinds of cancer. And they tested it, and it was so toxic that the FDA banned it from further experimentation. They said, this thing's so bad, stop testing it. It's terrible. Somehow, Fauci managed to get it approved by the FDA. And all these people that had been terrorized for years that, you got a positive test, you're going to die, they all flocked to AZT. And there's one historian, and he's a gay guy. He's Harvard trained, statistician. He said he estimates 300,000 gay men alone died of AZT poisoning. I had a friend who was perfectly healthy, and he got the test results, and he got on AZT, and within a year he just wasted away and he was gone. So they don't use it anymore. But to show you how twisted the world is, Fauci declared that a victory. That was his proof. So that's the model. The model is tell people there's a new disease that no one's ever seen before. Tell them that everybody's at risk. Tell them if they get a positive test, they're going to die. Make them sit on pins and needles for months and months and months, and then roll out your crap, whatever it happens to be. So they've been doing that forever, and they played that playbook with COVID. Now, interestingly enough, the guy that invented the PCR test, do you know what that is, PCR test? So for people that don't know, the PCR test it's not supposed to be a test. The man that invented it, Kary Mullis, and he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for it, so he's not a lightweight. And he invented it. He said this should never be used as a diagnostic test. It's not meant to test. It's meant to amplify genetic material. So if you're doing genetic research, you have to wait for stuff to grow biologically. It just takes forever. So the PCR amplifies the growth of genetic material so you can have material to work with. So basically, you can find anything in anybody's blood if you run enough cycles of the PCR test. In fact, before COVID happened, somebody went through the New York City subway system with swabs, and they were swabbing, they found every disease known to man from every corner of the globe. But it was in small numbers, and people have healthy enough immune systems to just not be, So anyway, it was the very same model. Declare a disaster, declare you're going to die, declare everybody's at risk, declare it's easily transmissible, scare the hell out of everybody, run a bogus test that tells everybody they've got it, make them wait, and then roll out the so-called solution. This sounds like COVID, right? And COVID was even worse because I don't know what I sent you, and I'm sorry that I don't know, but I wrote another book called What the Nurses Saw.
Yes, I was about to ask about that because what you're talking about dovetails into your other book, also called Fauci's First Fraud.
This is one of the grimmest tales ever, and basically, I'll give you an example. And these are all firsthand accounts from veteran nurses, by the way, not flaky people that just got out of school yesterday. We're talking about like people that have been like military nurses, or in battle zones, or nurses in refugee camps. Nurses that do air vac. For like someone gets hurt in the mountains, and they go on with it. Like hardcore nurses. Yeah. So one of the most horrible stories I heard. This happened in a New York City public hospital. A young man came in his 30s. He was hysterical because he was having trouble breathing, and he'd been watching all the news about COVID. So he went in, and the nurse saw him and said, "Oh, this guy's just having a panic attack." Well, he got whisked away into the COVID ward. They intubated him. They put him on a ventilator, and 3 days later, he was dead. And this is a very that's sort of the template for how a lot of people, quote, died of COVID. Now, for people that don't know what intubation is, they call it the garden hose. That's how what they call it in-house. It's you take a hose and you basically put it down somebody's throat all the way down into their bronchial area. To do that, you have to knock them out. You have to paralyze them. There are drugs called paralytics so that you don't move. And you have to give them very strong analgesics like fentanyl, believe it or not. And then you don't just give them a pill and they fall asleep. You have a drip in their arm. You might have anywhere from 3 to 15 different drips that are just constantly going into your body to keep you under, paralyzed, and free of pain. And then they have a machine that basically breathes, forces air down into your lungs, and then it goes out, and then it simulates breathing. Well, if you put, and anybody that does that for a living, and we interviewed, they're called respiratory therapists, the people that operate those machines, they say, look, we only do that at the end of the road, if there's no other hope. And then as soon as we put somebody on a external respirator, we immediately, next day, test to see if they're healthy enough to take them off. Why? Because we know just simply being on that respirator with the invasive procedure and all those drugs and immobile. And what are you eating? You're not eating. You're being fed by a tube. How are you? I mean, if we think this through, it's a very unsanitary situation. You have to be cleaned regularly. I mean, it's a mess, right? So they always want to get people off right away. So what did Fauci do? They incentivized the hospitals to put people on these ventilators. You got a big 5-figure bonus just for putting them on one. And if you kept them on for 96 hours or longer, you got another bonus. In other words, they took the normal medical procedure that has been going on since the beginning of time, and they incentivized people, they incentivized hospitals to keep people on the vents longer than they should be. So they were saying people were dying, of COVID. A lot of people were dying of being on a vent, because you have a good chance of dying or being disabled for a long time if you're on a vent, just by virtue of being on the vent process.
That happened here too.
What's that? That
also happened, yeah.
Oh yeah, they did it. They did it all over. And then the other thing they did was there's a drug called Remdesivir. And it's a drug that was used to try to treat Ebola when the Ebola, and that's another Fauci production. I mean, are there diseases in Africa? Sure. Are there people in certain circumstances who are living in really rough conditions who develop? Yeah, absolutely. And so they were trying to treat this thing called Ebola, and they said, "Oh man, Ebola is terrible. It makes people's kidneys and livers basically explode. I mean, not literally, but it just destroys liver and kidney." So they were saying, "Oh, Ebola is so bad, it liquefies your internal organs." No, it was the Remdesivir that was doing that. And they know it. And it's actually listed as an adverse reaction. Kidney and liver damage is listed on the paper as an adverse reaction. So again, somehow this drug, which had been basically withdrawn. It wasn't used to treat Ebola. It wasn't used to treat anything else. But suddenly Fauci said, "Hey, this works with COVID." And they started giving people a drug. And by the way, this drug comes in a bag. It's, again, you don't just take a pill. It's a bag. It's a drip into your arm. And again, Fauci and friends in the United States financially incentivized the hospitals to administer remdesivir, and they would pay you based on how if you went through if you gave them one bag, you'd get a certain amount of money, but if you went through a whole course, you'd get more money. So we found one case where this poor fellow was put through 3 separate courses of remdesivir. And every time the hospital's just hitting the cash register, right? So many millions of dollars were made by putting people on remdesivir. And the way it went was you'd come in to the hospital and maybe you didn't even have any symptoms. Maybe you had a broken arm and they test you for COVID. And if it came positive, they put you in the COVID wing. Now you're scared, right? I mean, we have to put ourselves back in the mindset. Oh my God, I'm in the wing with the deadly disease. And then they would say, oh, you're upset. I can see you're upset. Would you like something to, help you relax? And they would give you, whatever tranquilizers they had available. Well, in the United States, I don't know how this works in other countries, but once you accept a psychiatric medication in the hospital, you no longer can get up and just walk out of the hospital because you are now under psychiatric care. And so they can keep you longer. So they would terrorize these people, and then they would put them on I forget the name of it, but it's an external vent, and it's a thing that goes completely over your face like this, and they just pump air really hard. It's like if you're driving a car at 100 miles an hour and you're a passenger and you stick your head out the window, the air is except it's going straight in your lungs. When you normally do that for somebody, you warn them. You're going to say, hey, this is really intrusive. So don't be afraid, and I'm going to be right here, and I'm going to, if you're worried, don't worry. Well, what they would do is they'd strap this thing on, flip it on, and then leave the people alone in the room. They wouldn't explain, and then they would panic. And then they'd say, oh boy, you're not doing well. I think you need full intubation, which is the procedure that I talked about lately. They had a whole assembly line. And we heard this story over and over. We heard it in Minnesota. We heard it in Florida. We heard it in so it's not like one bad. Initially I thought it was one bad hospital in New York because I've visited people in the public hospitals in New York, and it's scary. It's not good. And I thought, okay, this is one bad hospital. All right. And then I realized as I talked to more nurses, oh my God, this happened all over the country. And then I realized they're all telling the same story, and they don't even know each other. Like, it's not like they all got together and said, oh, let's cook up a story. It's like I would talk to nurses in Florida and they go, oh, this is what happened. I talked to nurses in Minnesota, California, Texas, New York State, New York City. And I realized, my God, this was a system. And then I looked into it, and by God, they set up financial incentives. And so I don't know how it is in other countries, but the hospital systems are run by Wall Street. And the most important person at any hospital is the CFO, the chief financial officer. The doctors and the nurses, they're just hired hands. And that's the other element to this. The doctors and nurses, some of the veterans were saying, what are you talking about? We're not going to intubate this guy. He doesn't need it. And I'm not going to give this guy remdesivir. Because what happened was they started giving remdesivir and they saw people dying. And they said, oh, one nurse in particular who's she worked in refugee camps, like she was an air vac. I mean, this is like a, gold star nurse, like not a flake. And she said, I'm not giving anybody this drug anymore. I'm done. And they said, you give it or you're out of here. And she wouldn't give it, and they fired her. And that was the other element. If you spoke up, if you said anything, you were fired. The other weird element is they had terror. It's just, there's so many pieces to this, but the other piece was they waived all the normal requirements for working in intensive care. Normally, the people working in intensive care are experienced with intensive care. They've received training, they've had experience, and so on. What they were doing in New York, I don't know what they were doing they're doing it all over the country. I don't know how they did it in other countries, but they waived that, and they said, if you've got an MD, if you've got a medical degree, you can come in and work in the COVID ward. You could be a podiatrist. You could be, anything. They were also bringing in nurses that not only didn't have intensive care experience, some of them hadn't even finished school yet. And this is crazy because these are young women. They don't know. I mean, I can't blame them. How do you know? You go to school, someone tells you what to do, you do it. I mean, I can't blame them. So they're working in these intensive care units where they're told that they're facing this dreaded disease. People are dying left and right all around them. They don't have any perspective. They don't have an experience that this is wrong. And the doctors, some of them were from other countries. Some of them could barely speak English. Like they would just fly these guys in and they paid them a fortune. Nurses were getting, I don't know what the doctors got, but the nurses were getting $10,000 a week to work in the COVID. Now, there's a lot of people who are going to say, hey, $10,000 a week, maybe I'll just do what I'm told. And I don't know what the doctors, so it was a complete cluster F, as they say, right? I don't know if they have that expression in South Africa, but it was designed. It was bureaucratically enabled, right? And that's the story. That's
the con. That's the con, and that's why it takes 2 volumes. Now, I can't find the segue because you've covered a lot of ground in your books. But I suppose perhaps the segue has to do with lots of death. But you've also written about what's going on in Gaza.
Absolutely.
And of course, linked to that is the Zionist Project and JFK, which is an absolutely fascinating link.
Well, it's propaganda is always the first horse that arrives, in the battle.
Right? There's the segue. Propaganda.
Right? And so forever, Arabs, they always call them Arabs. It's like they don't distinguish. They speak Arabic. That doesn't mean they're Arabs. They could be Egyptian. They could be Moroccan. Moroccan's not an Egyptian. And an Egyptian's not an Algerian. And a Palestinian, it's like crazy. But that's the first level of propaganda. Oh, they're all Arabs, and they're all, and this has been going back for hundreds of years. They're all, they're unreliable. They're crafty. They're shifty. They're violent. There's all this madness, right? So that's the drumbeat that's been going on not for decades, but for centuries, right? And then, of course, I don't know how it is in South Africa, but in the United States, we're just completely. Our media is completely, and our politicians are completely in bed and the Zionist Project, I think, is a good way to describe it. They've done a very good job of corrupting our politicians. They either pay them off or they blackmail them. They do a very good job of controlling the news media. So here we have in broad daylight genocide. That goes. I mean, it just gets when you think it can't be any more horrific, they do something even more unbelievable. So what I did, and I saw that coming a mile away. And so what I did was, when South Africa, the great Republic of South Africa, filed a claim against Israel in the World Court, and they did it so fast. I said, all right, we all need a copy. We need a physical copy of this claim with all the footnotes, and we need to make sure we need to save all the evidence online because sometimes websites go down. So what we did was we put the South African complaint, the whole thing, with some introductory essays and so on, in book form. And then we backed up every single website, because that's the one thing I've learned in my years as a web journalist is that websites disappear. Websites with important information tend to disappear. So we had that book out even before the trial started. The day that I heard there was a formal complaint, we were immediately, making that book. So that was round 1. Round 2, because Americans are very fond of JFK, is we published a book called JFK Anti-Imperialist. And we wanted to make the point that this beloved president of ours was against imperialism.
But but he was one of the very few U.S. presidents that wasn't completely bought by the Zionist Project.
Well, you know why? His father. A lot of people aren't aware of this because there's mythology on the Kennedy side too. His father was at one point the 5th richest man in America. So his father had Bill Gates, Elon Musk type wealth. His father was also very deeply embedded in the Democratic Party. He had thought about running for president himself. So he was a wheeler and dealer, and he had already wired the country for himself to be president. It didn't work out for various reasons. And then the third element that Joseph Kennedy had, because there would have never been a JFK or an RFK in our we would never have known these guys existed had it not been for their dad. Okay, they were bright men, they were courageous men, they were good men, but without the juice from their dad, they would, one guy, JFK wanted to be a journalist, RFK wanted to be an attorney. They didn't have these grand things. So the third thing that the father had, which nobody ever talks about, is that he is the man, among many financial things that he did, he is the man that modernized Hollywood as an industry. When he went out to Hollywood, it was this, like, on a tripod, a guy with a thing, two actors, and then sound came in. And that took what was a very inexpensive cottage industry and made everything super expensive. Well, you need a good financier if you're going to get engaged in super expensive enterprises. Joseph Kennedy was the financial genius that managed the financial transformation of Hollywood from this very primitive cottage industry to this really big industrial thing. So the reason I bring this up is he knew all about publicity, glamour, taking pictures from the right angles. So if you look at the photographs of the Kennedys, they always look like gods. They're always, everything's lit. They're with their little kids. They're on a sailboat. They're playing touch football. That wasn't an accident, right? So you had one of the richest men in America who was wired into the Democratic Party, who knew how to position. And he couldn't get in, so he wanted his sons to get in. So to answer your point, they owed nothing to anybody. Their dad put them in that position. They didn't have to go around on bended knee and say, oh, we need a little money for this campaign. No, they didn't have that problem at all. So they were the only fully independent, maybe Roosevelt to a degree. I mean, no one's ever fully independent, but they were very independent. And the third book that I just want to talk a little about anti-imperialism. There used to be an anti-imperialism stream in American culture. It was active in the 19th century. Our famous writer Mark Twain was an anti-imperialist. Andrew Carnegie, believe it or not, the great steel magnate, was an anti-imperialist. Grover Cleveland, a former president, was an anti-imperialist. Well, after World War I, they just beat down anybody that wanted to talk about anti-imperialism. It just disappeared. That whole movement just disappeared. So John F. Kennedy was actually an anti-imperialist in the White House. And so what I did in that book was I have a collection of his speeches. He gave a speech on the floor of the Senate saying that the French had to get out of Vietnam and stop, it was a disaster. It was he also, and here's where it really gets interesting. He gave a similar speech that the French had to get out of Algeria. Okay, now think about this. He's a senator from a state, a pretty conservative state in those days. We were in the middle of the Cold War. There was no political benefit to be had by speaking on behalf of the Algerian people. None. In fact, it cost him. But he believed in it super strongly. And now here's something, we all know, everybody knows everything about JFK except the stuff that matters, which is propaganda, right? When France finally pulled out after 150 years, and they killed nearly 1/3 of the population of Algeria over 150 years. I mean, it was as brutal as it could be. They elected their president, and what did JFK do? He invited that man to the White House. And usually you see these pictures, like there's a chair and here and a chair over there, and they're sitting there and shaking hands. No. He took over the entire back yard of the White House, the Rose Garden. He had color guards from all the 5 militaries. And it wasn't 3 guys with a flag. It was 20 guys deep from each military. He had the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had the Vice President. He had everybody in the government that he could find that day come out to honor this man from Algeria, and an Arab, right? Because they speak Arabic in Algeria. Now, that was, and I have never seen, and I ask, and by the way, everybody can find this, just go Algeria, President JFK, YouTube, you can watch the reception. I have never seen an American president give a reception like that to any human being. What was Kennedy saying? And he said, we believe in freedom. We're going to compete, and we're going to compete hard, but we're not going to put our feet on, our heel on your neck while we're doing it. And we're going to treat you like brothers. That's what he wanted to do. Now, interestingly enough, who was sending mercenaries to Algeria to help the French kill Algerians? Our friends.
South Africa.
South Africa and their friends, Israel. And for young people that don't know this, the very last countries to support apartheid were Israel and the United States.
So, and the Crown, actually.
And of course, yeah. I mean, they're always they just can't let it go. They just can't let it go. So that gives, I think, some insight into where Kennedy's head was at. And he was fighting.
He also didn't like the CIA.
He didn't like the CIA at all. And his father didn't like the CIA. And President Truman, who approved of the CIA being formed, didn't like the CIA. In fact, he wrote an editorial after Kennedy was killed, making some veiled commentary. That editorial was pulled because they used to have issues like the first issue would come out in the morning, and then that only ran once. It was never seen again. But yeah, a lot of people were concerned about the CIA. Now, I discovered, much to my surprise, is that there's a wonderful journalist called Richard Medhurst, who you may have heard of. In fact, people haven't. He's really good, and he's the guy that broke the story that there was some crazy plan to drop 300 atomic bombs in the Sinai Peninsula to build a canal from the Red Sea to roughly Gaza, actually. And I saw that, and I learned it was real. And I thought, and I saw the time frame. And I said, well, President Kennedy would have never gone for that. He wouldn't have gone for that. He was the guy that stopped all above ground atomic testing. So I Googled atomic testing, canal, Sinai, Kennedy, and up came this history that I'd never heard of, which is that in the summer, and this is where it really becomes important. In the summer of 1963, excuse me, is that right? Yeah, summer of 1963. What were the Kennedys doing? A lot of this was classified until relatively recently, but there were all the cables, all the letters, all the telegrams, and it was very clear they were battling with Israel behind the scenes. And they had 2 points they were making to Israel in the summer of 1963. Number one, you may not have an atomic bomb. Okay, you want to do nuclear power, you want to do nuclear research, fine. We need to go to your lab right now, and we need to see what you're doing, because if you're developing an atomic weapon, you and I are going to have big problems. And Kennedy was polite, he was cordial, but he was emphatic on that point. Your support, you're putting the support of your country from our country at risk if you do not allow us to see your nuclear facility. Now they kept postponing and putting it off, and the weather's not right, and it's high holiday. I mean, all this nonsense. And now his brother, who is Attorney General, unprecedented in American history to have two brothers at that level. His brother was on the Zionists about they're not filing as foreign lobbyists. Okay. In our country, you're allowed to lobby for anybody you want. But if you're lobbying for a foreign country, you have to register with the State Department. And believe it or not, anytime you have a meeting or a publication or anything with more than 3 people, and you're talking on behalf of that country, you have to report that meeting and the content of that meeting or speech or conference to the State Department. It's a very strict rule. Every country follows it, even the UK. There's only one country that doesn't follow it to this day, and that's Israel. And so they were given a free pass to propagandize without limit, so that's that, right? So I'm thinking, let's see, summer of 63, the Kennedys are fighting the Zionist project. Fall of 63, Kennedy gets a bullet in the back of the head. I wonder if there's any other connections between the Zionist project and Kennedy. So I start digging. Most people know that it was not a lone gunman who just had a grievance and got up in a building and shot Kennedy. A lot of people are willing to say that the CIA and the mob, organized crime, were somehow involved, right? I mean, a lot of people go there, but they're very vague, and they always say, it was rogue elements, right? Which is sort of like rogue elephants, right? But rogue elements of the CIA, they never name them, right? And then when they mention the mob, they always mention the Italian guys, Trafficante, Here's the reality. Let's go to the mob side. There was a mobster named Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky literally put the organized and organized crime. Right? We hear of organized crime. How did that start? Meyer Lansky and his buddy Lucky Luciano. They were bootleggers, and there was a lot of violence, hijacking people's beer trucks and all kinds of craziness going on. And Meyer Lansky called a meeting of all the gangsters and said, look, guys, there's plenty of money for everybody. Stop messing up here. So you get Cleveland, you get Buffalo, you get this, you get that. Don't cross each other's lines, and we're going to all make a whole lot more money. So then they established a thing called the commission, so that if anything important had to happen that affected all of organized crime, they would all get together physically and plan it out. Right? To enforce this commission, Meyer Lansky and friends created a thing called Murder Incorporated. Okay, which a lot of people have heard of from the movies, and you kind of think of it as like three guys in Brooklyn, and they killed some people occasionally. No, Murder Incorporated was a nationwide network of hitmen, and another word for hitmen is really assassin. It's the same job. And if you think of what a hitman has to do, a hitman has to surveil. You have to know where your target is going. What's his routine. You have to know what his security is. You have to have a plan for when he's going to be vulnerable. You have to have a plan to commit the crime and get away. You have to have a plan to commit the crime and get away and confuse the investigation and think it's somebody else. This is all what a hitman does. So Meyer Lansky controlled 100 plus professional hitmen. Okay. He also was a Zionist. He ran guns to Israel when it was illegal to run guns to Israel. He helped Israel get nuclear material. So he was the man who was one of the key, and he was the money launderer, right? Very easy to commit a crime, hard to get away with the crime, hard to get away with hiding the money. That's why Al Capone, the great gangster, went to jail, not because he did all these crimes, but because he didn't file his taxes correctly. So the whole of organized crime looked to this one guy, because they're running around, shooting people, robbing banks, stealing drugs, running prostitutes, all this crazy stuff, piling up the money. Then they would go to Meyer, and Meyer would launder it. And he used a bank. He used a lot of methods. He used casinos. He actually used laundromats. But he used a bank in Switzerland, owned by Zionist elements. Okay, so when they say the mob was involved in killing Kennedy, Meyer Lansky had to be involved, but they never mention his name. You can read 100 books. You can go to every assassination conference. They'll always talk about the Italians. They'll never talk about Meyer Lansky. Now, when we go to the CIA, it gets even worse. You have the director of the CIA, right? He's the boss. And have you heard that, Alan Dulles was somehow involved in the assassination? That it's sort of for people that are into the assassination. They'll say, that he was mad at Kennedy. He was the director for a while. They never talk about this other fellow. This guy was director of counterintelligence, okay? And I'll explain what counterintelligence is in a second. This guy was counterintelligence head for 5 different directors of the CIA. He got his job in the mid-50s. He didn't leave till the mid-70s. So CIA directors came and went. This guy always was in position. Counterintelligence, to sum it up simply, is the guy that keeps the secrets for the CIA. He's the guy that makes sure that covert operations are designed to be covert and that they stay covert. That's what counterintelligence is, to oversimplify it. And he had the same job for over 20 years. Guess what? He was one of the founders of the Mossad. He helped the Mossad get created. Because, when you start a new intelligence agency, you don't know what you're doing. So you go to your big brother. The Americans went to the British and the Israelis went to the CIA. So he was one of the founders of the Mossad. Bizarrely, while being head of counterintelligence, he was also head of the Israeli desk. Now, the way the desk works in the CIA is, if I'm the head of the Brazil desk, every bit of news that comes to the CIA gets filtered to this Brazil desk. Now, we collect it all. And then anybody in the government that wants to know what's going on in Brazil, we distribute it to them. So this guy, in addition to being head of counterintelligence, a founder of the Mossad, was also running the Israeli desk, which is unprecedented in the history of the CIA. There are not one, but two memorials to him in Israel, and the Israelis considered him the most important Zionist in America. And his name was James Jesus Angleton. And again, you can read many, 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 many assassination books. If they mention him at all, they mention him in passing. And if so the two guys from the CIA side and the organized crime side who had the most power and the most ability to carry out this assassination and cover it up happened to be Zionists.
It's always like that.
It's crazy. But what's really weird is, I'm telling you, you can read every assassination book. They'll never mention this. So who's controlling the assassination research community? Can you get your book published by a major publisher if you mention this? No. Can you speak at a big assassination conference and get paid and sell your books in the back of the room? No. So the propagandizing goes really, really deep. How could we not know that our president, our beloved president, was fighting Israel the summer before he got murdered? How can that not be common knowledge? But it's not.
Let me ask you a question, Ken. Is America a vassal state of Israel, or is Israel a vassal state of America?
It's a good question. And it's like, let's say you're a gangster, right? And you don't personally want to dirty your hands. You don't want to go down to this particular bad side of town and run things, So you find some promising gangsters and you put them in charge. So I think that's what Israel is ultimately. If we go back to, I always forget the name of this guy, the famous banking family, the big ones in England, and they're the ones that actually financed the movement of Zionists to Israel in the first place. I'll think of their name, but people just don't know how rich is, And I'll give you an example of how rich is. This same family created, as among many projects, they just had like you and I might open a restaurant together, and we'll, raise the money and we'll rent a place, we'll hire chefs, we'll get food. That keeps us busy. These guys have so much money and so much resources. They terraform the globe. For example, one of their agents, Rothschild. The Rothschilds wrote the checks for the original Zionists to go to Israel or to Palestine. Why did they do that? Well, one, there was the canal that went through Egypt, that they didn't like the fact that, they knew the canal is so important. It's the literal link between East and West. And even though we're in a digital world now, things are moved by ship. The things we eat, the things we wear, the things we drive, the things that build our house, it's moved by ship. So that canal is super important. So the Rothschilds clearly wanted to have their gangsters in place. They also wanted to be able to lend money. The population in Palestine was self-sufficient economically. And this is a theme. Iraq was self-sufficient economically. The Palestinians were self-sufficient economically. The Libyans were self-sufficient economically. That's not helpful. The Russians are self-sufficient economically. Wall Street does not have its claws in those countries. Iran is self-sufficient economically, right? And so if you're a mega banker, and it's not necessarily the Rothschilds, I mean, they were the ones that got the ball rolling. It's this vast complex. When you're a banker, you're a lot like a loan shark. You know what a loan shark does? A loan shark lends money. A guy's gambling, he loses money. The loan shark lends him money, and he has to pay him 1% a week. Banking is not much different. You've got this money, you want to put it to work. So you look around the globe. And if you're on the Rothschild level, you're looking around the globe going, all right, I got billions of dollars here. Like I don't have to worry about that problem. I don't have that problem. But they have a problem of how do I put my money to work? So in terms of the Middle East, they thought, well, let's put some, blue-eyed, blonde-haired European guys smack dab in the middle of this place that we want to take over ultimately. So that's how the original Zionists got there. Another example that of this, which I think is enlightening, is when I was in Guatemala and I was talking to a human rights attorney. We talking about all kinds of things, and we happened to be in the center of the original center of the coffee industry in Guatemala. And he says, oh yeah, all this was built by the Rothschilds. One of their agents discovered that you could grow coffee here very well, and there was a lot of underused land. And so the Rothschilds came in and they brought the trees, they brought the experts, they taught the big landowners how to grow coffee, they built the warehouses, they built the trains, they built the ports. They invested all this money into creating the coffee industry in Guatemala. So that's the level at which the Rothschilds work, or the big banks work. Let's call them the big banks. So that's who put the Zionists in Palestine originally. And so I think, is Israel running the world? No. Israel's been given a free rein, or the Zionists have been given a free run to do all kinds of crazy stuff, because we who are the royal we see them as useful in a part of the world that we ultimately want to take over. Because clearly the U.S. is on board with everything the Zionist project's doing. I mean, it's so obvious. Right? If we stop sending weapons tomorrow, the genocide would be over, because they're running out of bombs. They can't make enough bombs. So it's the U.S. But the question is, who runs the U.S. is my big question is. And it might go back to who runs the UK, and there might be, and I think what it is huge capital is looking at the world and saying, look, I don't like these guys that are self-sufficient. We need them to be borrowing money from us. Do you know the book, The Economic Hitman? Does that ring a bell?
I interviewed him.
Oh, that's the deal. It's like, well, gee, you guys are feeding yourselves, and you could use maybe some science and that we have, and some technology we have, but you're pretty self-sufficient. That's not good. We can't make money if you're self-sufficient. So let's put it in a big dam. It's going to cost $10 trillion, and we'll front the money, and you got to pay us back. Of course, you never can, so we've got our hooks in you forever. So I think it's that mentality that runs the U.S., that runs the UK, that enables Israel to exist. That's my take.
There is so much to talk about, Ken, and you've written a lot, and you've covered a lot of territory. And I would love to chat more, but let's come in for a landing. Yeah. How can I follow your work and get your books?
No publisher will publish my books, and as I found out when I was helping Robert F. Kennedy Jr. get his book distributed, which was The Real Anthony Fauci. Bookstores won't so-called independent bookstores didn't carry that book, wouldn't carry it, wouldn't even take orders for it. So anyway, I have to use Amazon. I also have Lulu. But if you go, I should know this better. I think if you go to brasscheckbooks.com, all my books are there. And maybe you could confirm that. I don't know. I know this is ridiculous that I don't know. Because otherwise I have independent websites, like I have Fauci'sFirstFraud.com. I have WhatTheNurseSsaw.com. I have JFKAntiWar.com. And those are not only book sale sites. We have lots of material, videos, interviews, all kinds of, so people can go very deep into the subjects, whether they buy the book or not. I'm publishing books because books are not easily disappeared. They're in your hand. They can't delete them. They can't block them on social media. You can hand a book to somebody. So that's why I'm in the book business now.
On that note, Ken McCarthy, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.